We're here to talk about long jump this morning, okay? Now, before I get started, I would be remiss if I didn't start off any long jump presentation by talking about the approach run. And I'm not going to get into a complete discussion of running mechanics and sprint mechanics and so forth, because that's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular lecture. But you as a jump coach need to realize, first of all, that your approach does three things for you. Number one is it develops the velocity you need for performance. Okay, secondly, it provides a certain degree of accuracy, meaning that you're trying to hit the board. But the third thing it does is it physically puts you in an environment from which to perform a setup and a takeoff. And that's an important thing to understand. A lot of times people look at the position at which you arise. It's a little more than just the position at which you arrive at the board. It's also the physical environment you've provided prior to that point. So you basically are developing there an environment, I like to call it, a physical environment and a pattern of movement that's going to have great effect on the way you take off. You know, from doing this for a long, long time, I can tell you that typically if I see kids that run this way, they tend to take off this way. If I see kids that run this other way, they tend to take off this other way. So always keep in mind that what we're doing here is providing a physical environment, and it's impossible to separate what you're doing in penultimate and takeoff from the environment that you are providing for the athlete in the way of the approach run and the way that you teach it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that particular environment. And there are several things that I'll mention. The first one I want to talk about is posture, the physical alignment and the physical functional state of the core of the body. When I look at posture in the final few steps of the approach, I look at basically two realms, and the first one is head alignment. Okay. When I see athletes come in the final few steps of the approach, I want to see the head align in a neutral position with respect to the spine. So no chin dropping, no head thrown back or anything like that. Wherever the back is, that's where we want the head to be. So it's a very neutral, simple alignment position. And one of the things we see so often with our jumpers is misalignments of the head or abrupt movements of the head. You know, so how many of you have jumpers who come in and they drop their chins in order to see the board? Okay. We all have those. There are also the kids that for some reason think that if you throw the head back at takeoff, that makes you go higher. Well, of course, that's not true, but it seems to be a common mistake. So neutral positions of the head are what we're looking for. The head weighs a lot. Head weighs about 15 pounds. So anytime you move it around in an abrupt or in your regular manner, you're going to create some disruptions. It's kind of like having a bowling ball in your backpack. You know, if you take off running with it and it shifts to one side or the other, it's going to throw you off a little bit. Well, keep in mind your head weighs almost as much as that bowling ball does. Some of us probably more than others, right? Okay. The second part that I look for as far as posture is concerned is the alignment of the pelvis. I look for a neutral alignment of the pelvis with respect to the spine. And when I say neutral alignment, I'm talking about my basic standing position here, as opposed to the typical anterior rotations that we see with a lot of athletes. Anterior rotations are, to simplify the terms, what we call butt-out postures, you know, that are associated with the excessive lordosis and so forth. So I'm constantly talking to athletes about neutral positions of the pelvis, keeping their butts underneath them, and preserving good pelvic alignment throughout the final few steps. You know, the pelvis is the rudder of the body. We'll discuss that in the triple jump to a much greater degree. But if the pelvis isn't aligned correctly, it's very difficult to create lift. It's very difficult to create upward takeoff angles that we want in these events. So so whatever way you find to convey this to your athlete is important. Now, a lot of pelvic alignment and pelvic posture comes from the way you accelerate. So we'll discuss acceleration mechanics a little later when we get up in the gym and how to teach that and how to get it there. But a lot of times our athletes have poor postures in the final few steps simply because we don't address it enough. So again, keep in mind that alignment of the head and alignment of the pelvis are the two most important elements as far as giving your athlete a chance to at least execute the penultimate and the takeoff correctly. Bad posture, you're going to have compromised takeoffs at best. Okay? Questions? Yeah, you know, coaching posture and teaching posture is boring, but it's not a matter of inches, it's a matter of feet. It's not small differences, it's big differences, and that's really where you make big gains, is through postural improvements. Now, the second thing that I try to provide, or I try to teach as I teach the final steps of the approach, is I want an elastic environment, meaning that I want a run that is elastic in nature. We all have heard the term stretch reflexes, and we know that the body operates more efficiently when we have stretch reflexes that are going on. And we need to understand that stretch reflexes can occur not only in our legs and in our arms and shoulders and so forth, but stretch reflexes can also occur in our postural musculature. So when I set up a run and I'm looking at it, there are basically three sources of elastic energy that I'm constantly looking at. And I'm going to share those with you now. The first one is your amplitude of movement. The second is oscillations of the pelvis. And the third is undulations of the body's center of mass. And I'll go through those in turn. First of all is amplitude of movement. It means range of motion at certain joints. In particular, the hip joint. How many of you teach your jumpers to run with their knees up? Sure, it's good science, right? Okay, because when you pick up your knee, you develop stretch reflexes in the hip extensors, and that enables a more powerful stroke down against the ground. But do you ever talk to your athletes about knees down? Because it's when you push the knee down that you're actually applying force to the ground, are you not? So that's just as important. See, when I see really good running, I look not only for how high the knee comes up, but I also look for how completely the hip extends or how far the knee pushes down. And at the end of each stride, I like to see the knee a little bit behind the other knee, a little bit behind vertical, meaning that as we push from this position, we push completely through the hip so that the knee is a little bit behind the vertical position, so that I'm getting a nice, complete, full extension of the hip with each stride. And a lot of athletes will cut that off prematurely. A lot of athletes will maybe show good hip extension through early parts of the run, but then they soften it up as they approach the board. So I'm looking for continual firing of the hip and continual pushing of the hip and extension of the hip as they move through takeoff. I ask my athletes to think of their thigh bone, their femur, as a pendulum, so that when they lift the thigh, when they lift the femur, we get stretch reflexes in the back here. But when they push down, we get stretch reflexes in the hip flexors that tend to pop the knee back up. So I have them think of it as a pendulum working through a big arc, and it's elastic pendulum, meaning it's like there's a rubber band attached to each side. And I want that range of motion to exist throughout the entire approach. And the biggest mistake that we see often is as we approach the board, we see that range of motion cut down. And when we see that range of motion cut down, two things happen. First of all, is we become less elastic and there's less stretch reflex going on in the hip. And the other thing that happens is because you've decreased the range of motion, then proportionally the jump is going to be decreased, because the range of motion that you jump is going to be decreased, because the range of motion that you exhibit in the runway, it's proportional to the displacement that you're going to get in the jump. So keeping the run open is the term that I use in my coaching. When I say open, I mean nice big open splits as we move through the board. It doesn't necessarily mean that the knee has to get to a 90-degree position, but that complete pushing idea is important, because that's where your forces are actually being applied and developed, and you do want to see a significant amplitude of movement there that's conserved throughout takeoff. Okay, we okay with that idea? Yeah. Don't allow your athletes to come in and start to sit down and shuffle in the final few steps and decrease this. Okay, the second thing here, oscillations of the pelvis. We need to understand that running doesn't begin in the legs, it begins in the hips, and some people would maybe even argue in the lumbar spine. If I'm running, or walking for that matter, when I step forward with my right foot, my right hip is a little in front of my left. That makes sense to you? Okay. Then when I step with my left hip is a little in front of my right. So if I look at the actual pelvic girdle as I run, it's oscillating, it's turning this way. So it's not still, it's actually moving. And also, what's happening basically is when it turns this way, certain muscles are stretched, and it develops stretch reflexes in postural musculature, and then it snaps back. So there's a lot of elastic energy that's being generated as the pelvis oscillates. Okay, now when I run, if I lift my right leg, my right hip is lower than my left. And then when I lift the left leg, my left hip is higher than my right. So I also have an up and down type of oscillation going on. So my hips are turning in this plane and they're turning in this plane. So what I have basically is a pelvic engine that's kind of oscillating and just doing this. throughout the entire approach run. And that's very important because that's the way that we run efficiently. See, all of these oscillations of the pelvis set up these stretch reflexes in the postural musculature and make us more efficient. And there are other benefits as well. Not only are we more efficient when we're elastic, but if the pelvis is moving and initiating movement, stride length becomes a little bit longer. Let me ask you this. How many of you coaches have ever had this problem? Excuse me. Your jumper comes down the runway in warm-ups, nails the board 2 or 3 times in a row. They're all ready to go, and then the competition starts and they're a foot behind. It's happened to us all, right? Okay, well, here's what happens, In the pelvic oscillation idea, it contributes to stride length, maybe that much to each stride length. So, when the jumper comes down in anticipation of takeoff, they start to square up and tighten up the hips, so the hip oscillation stops, and you lose that little bit of extra stride length. So if you square up on the last 4 steps and tighten up the hips on those final 4 steps, you've lost 4 times this much, which is about how much you'll be behind the board. So rather than moving them up, we need to talk to them about staying relaxed and keeping the pelvis oscillating as they move through takeoff. Does that make sense to you? And that explains a lot of your approach inaccuracies when you really understand this particular phenomena and so forth. How many of you teach your jumpers to sprint, or your sprinters to sprint relaxed? See, well, then you're already teaching this, but basically when you allow sprinters or teach sprinters to sprint in a relaxed state, that's what you're really telling them in a more scientific or more technical manner, is you're telling them allow the pelvis to move, because that's the way human beings operate. The pelvis oscillates, it makes small movements, and the legs amplify those small movements with bigger movements, okay? So that's what we're looking at there, oscillations of the pelvis. And the third thing I look for is undulation of the center of mass. If you look at really good jumpers and really good sprinters as they move down the track, at the instant at which they leave the ground from each stride, you see a little bit of an upward component, meaning that there's a little bit of a vertical push. There's a vertical component to each step. And that's very important. You see, what we're trying to do here is, if I look at this jumper from the side, I want to see a little bit of a vertical component. Obviously not, excessive. That's not good. But we want to see just a little bit of a bounce. And I like to see my jumpers just a little bit of a bounce as they approach the board, because that provides us a vertical oscillation environment. Here's what I mean by that. So, a good jumper is coming down the runway. Here we're long jumping. And let's say I put a dot here on their hip, and I'm just going to track where that dot goes. We're going to see a little bit of this. And that's important. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a setup and a takeoff. So this oscillation here basically is magnified into the jump that we see. Does that make sense to you? Okay? So what I'm saying is that if you come in and this oscillation doesn't exist, then it becomes very hard to create lift. But if, on the other hand, you provide that vertical oscillation environment, well, then it becomes much easier. And if you ever get your car stuck in the mud or in the snow, yeah, how do you get it out? Exactly. You rock it. What do? You push it one way, then you let it fall back, then you push it, you let it fall back, and it just bounces back and forth until you get a real big push and you bounce it on out. And that's the exact kind of concept that we need to have in teaching the long jump as far as the vertical qualities are concerned. We get this little bit of bounce going and we magnify it into a big bounce. We rock it out, so to speak. And that's what we're trying to do. That's why this whole vertical environment thing is so important. Because when we don't have it, we typically run into problems in creating the penultimate and takeoff, and we stop, and other problems tend to arise from there. Now, don't get me wrong, this should not be excessive. What I'm saying is, something like this is obviously excessive, but what I'm saying is that this can be just as inefficient as the excessive patterns. We've all seen Europeans with the big bouncy runs. They don't do everything right sometimes, but what they may be doing wrong, some of it's being compensated for, and some of it's being helped by real good vertical movement on the runway. Let's say you as a coach don't have a good eye for this. The thing I like to do as a coaching practice is to simply watch shin angles as the jumpers approach the board. So for example, as my jumpers come in, this is kind of the picture that I like to see at touchdown. As they touch down from each stride, that's the position I want to see. Obviously, the alignment of the pelvis and the head are good, but more importantly is this alignment of this shin here. And what I look for is shin angles that are just a few degrees off of vertical. Just a few degrees off of vertical. If you see shin angles that are basically fairly close to perpendicular to the ground, then you can be pretty sure that the vertical characteristics are good. And the thing that you'll see often in jumpers is shin angles that tend to tilt a bit as they approach the board. You know, one of the things, if you ever come to our place and listen to me coach, one of the things that you'll hear me talk to my jumpers about as they approach the board is continuously pushing up, meaning that we're trying to create vertical velocities, not horizontal velocities in those last few steps. Because we've already had 14 or 15 steps to develop horizontal stuff, now's the time to make sure that we're bouncy and that we're creating the vertical environment that we need in order to take off correctly. Okay? Questions there? So that's the elastic environment that I try to put them in, and these are the things that I think are really important, and I try to make sure that they're conserved. The posture and all of these elastic energy generating mechanisms are all preserved as we move through takeoff. Questions? And the third thing is one that I've mentioned already. It's maintenance of pushing kinetics, meaning that I want to make sure that the athletes are continuing to push against the ground rather than grab against the ground. So what I'll do is, as they're coming in, I'm continuously talking to them about taking the foot and driving it directly down with a pushing movement and then extending the hip correctly and completely. That makes sense? As opposed to letting the feet get out in front and pulling types of movements. And when we start talking about long jump and how to plant the foot and all these different kinds of things, that'll make a lot more sense to you. Okay. Yes, sir?
An athlete's like stretching in that last step to get forward, is that the same idea they're tightening up, do you think?
It depends. Sometimes they'll tighten up and they know they need to be on the board and they find themselves far away, so they'll reach on the last step to get there. But a lot of times when you see athletes who stick their foot out on the board, it's because they started to stick their feet out in the final few steps. Okay? And it's very difficult. I found it early in my coaching career difficult to teach these things. The big breakthrough that I made personally was that I found out that if an athlete only focused on one leg, they could do it much better, and it was twice as slow. So what I will typically do is, if I have athletes that are having problem with their running mechanics, I will typically have them perform whatever I'm asking them to do only with, say, the right side or only with the left side. Because then you're working on one leg only, so everything feels a lot slower because they're only focusing on one leg, and the other leg tends to kind of follow anyway. So typically on days when we may be working on penultimate mechanics, I may be looking primarily at cueing what's happening on the runway with that particular side. On a day when I might be doing more technical stuff that's working on the takeoff side, then I'll probably be cueing running mechanics on that same side. Okay? Because the way they connect is something I'll share with you shortly. Okay. Questions? And when you understand this stuff, I think a lot of your approach management issues disappear. You know, because a lot of your fouling, a lot of those types of issues just tend to be related to postural issues and so forth. How many of you have an athlete who fouls by an inch? And then, you know, or a couple centimeters, and you back them up and they foul by a couple of centimeters, and you back them up and they foul by a couple of centimeters. It's happened to everybody, right? And before you know it, they're starting in the next province or whatever, and they're still fouling by a couple of centimeters. Well, keep in mind, the body has reflexes, you know, and one of the reflexes that the body has is a stability reflex. So anytime the body senses instability, we tend to advance foot contact. You know, think about it. Have you ever been outside jogging and you trip? Yeah, what do you do when you trip? Well, the first thing you do is make sure nobody else saw you, right? But what do you do is, as you get forward, you stick out your foot in order to regain balance. Well, keep in mind, that was instinctive. That was reflexive. So when you have a jumper who comes in and possibly they're a little bit forward, or they're overworking, or maybe the pelvis is misaligned just a touch as they come in, well, inherently, they're going to do something to create stability. And what's the answer? They'll stick out the foot. So why do they always foul by the same amount? It's not because of where the check mark is, it's because the posture is always the same. And the alignment of the pelvis is always the same. So a lot of your approach management issues are derived from postural issues as well. Okay? That won't eliminate all your problems, but when you start understanding this, it takes care of a lot of them. A lot. Sometimes you have kids that have such poor pelvic posture that they're just turning over like hell in the final few steps to save themselves, and they end up behind the board a lot because they can't keep those elastic processes going or don't have them going at all. Questions? Okay. Yes?
So do you rarely move the approach?
Oh, I move it, but just generally speaking, we coaches move it way too much and way too often. And as far as approach management is concerned, I think it's important for the coach to have a plan, rather than just reacting to things that tend to happen. If after you've worked with an athlete through a few meets, you should kind of know what the trends are typically going to be, what that athlete's problems are going to be. For example, if you have an athlete who tends to get excited as the competition goes, you may have a plan to continually back that athlete up. But I've had one athlete, for example, I'll give you the good example. John Moffitt in Athens. John Moffitt, as he approaches the board, is a notorious chopper, meaning that he notoriously tends to sit down and get choppy and so forth. So what I always have to do with John Moffitt is keep him too far away from the board early, to get him where he's bouncy and loose and open and so forth. And then after we kind of get in a rhythm there where he's doing some things right, then we kind of sneak him up a little bit. That's exactly how the long jump competition went in Athens. We started him too far away. After our first move up, he jumped okay, and then we moved up like another foot, and that's when he, jumped his medal jump, which was great for him because he's frankly not that phenomenal of an athlete, But sometimes the moon and the sun and the stars and all come together on a day, But anyway, that's the point I'm trying to make, is you need to have some kind of plan according to it. So what I'll typically do is I'll do run-throughs and warm-ups. I have a check mark that I use, like most of you probably do. I'll typically make an adjustment, and then I'll have a plan from that point on. But keep in mind, replication is the athlete's job, not yours. They still have a responsibility to be able to replicate things to some degree. Okay. Questions? So when I have an athlete that is on their check mark and on the board in warm-ups, and suddenly they're 2 foot over the check mark on the first jump, it's not my fault. All right? Okay? Either you should have been pushing more in warm-ups or something, Questions? Okay, good. Let's move on. And so basically, when I look at approach running, that's kind of what I'm doing there. And in these final few steps, all of these processes that I mentioned, I try to make sure that they are continued. You see, that's why distribution of the run is so important to me. A lot of times I see jumpers who can't perform or can't take off efficiently simply because they don't distribute the run correctly. The effort of the run and the way the phases play out just isn't done correctly. For example, a lot of times probably the single biggest thing that I see is athletes who try to turn over or increase their frequency too much in the final few steps. Remember, frequency is the enemy of amplitude of movement. So if you try too hard to turn over in the final few steps, typically you get low, squatty, all of the elastic stuff tends to disappear, and then it becomes very difficult to take off and set up and take off correctly. So that's a very, very common mistake. I'm not saying that you shouldn't continue to feel an increase in rhythm through takeoff. That's not true. But a lot of athletes tend to overdo that. There is another edge to that sword, so to speak. And I constantly preach to my athletes that, and this is the philosophy that we try to bring, is that we want to work the back half of our run hard so that we can kind of relax and position ourselves to jump in the front part of the run. And that's the philosophy that we use in practice all the time. Now, don't go home and say, Boo said you should slow down at the board or you're not I didn't say that. But what I'm saying is that you should get the vast majority of your acceleration done in the first third of the run. And the acceleration that's happening in the final part of the run is a very small proportion of the total acceleration you should be showing on the runway.
Is it like 190%? Or is it like a 30 together? Like you're giving 100 in that first part and then you're...
If you're looking, keep in mind, it's not just velocity, it's momentum development, and I want them to spend a serious amount of time pushing and developing momentum in the first 6, 7, maybe 8 steps. Okay, so I don't know exactly what it is if you graft it, but I would, if I had to make a guess, because I don't have the biomechanics equipment to give you specific numbers, but I would be willing to guess that by the time that you get to the midpoint of the run, 75% or 80% of your acceleration should probably be accomplished. Maybe I'd say 75 to 80% in 50% of the run, as measured by number of steps. And I don't know if that's exactly accurate, but it does convey the picture, I think, that I'm trying to. Because most of the athletes that come to me for consulting purposes and things like that, the reason they can't take off is they're just trying to work those final steps too hard. Okay, and that's the time to not slow down, but at least relax a bit so you can position your body to execute the takeoff. Okay. Questions? All right. Let's move on. Let's start talking about what happens in those final few steps, and let's talk a little bit about penultimate mechanics and so forth. Is that interesting to you? Okay. Let's talk about the penultimate. The first thing when I look at the penultimate step is where does it contact with respect to the body's center of mass. Now we all know if a step contacts out in front of us, then we decelerate or we slow down. So we want the penultimate step to be located basically underneath us. Now I'm going to introduce you to a particular philosophy here, or that I have, is that I try to coach a technical model that is more geared toward what it feels like to the athlete than what it looks like on the film. And keep in mind that when an athlete is moving really fast at 10 meters a second or whatever the case may be, then things feel a little bit different to them. So from time to time I'll be pointing out certain issues to you, that basically situations in jumping where this is what it looks like to the coach, but it doesn't feel that way to the athlete. And I'll be trying to point those out to you. Now, this is one of them. You coach your jumpers to keep the penultimates underneath them and possibly even behind them in order to minimize deceleration on the penultimate step. But when you stop that film at penultimate touchdown on a good jump, you're going to see about that much front side distance, meaning that it's actually going to contact just a little in front, but you as a coach are working constantly toward minimizing that. Now, the way the penultimate contacts is important to me. I coach exaggerated dorsiflexion of the foot prior to contact. Exaggerated, meaning that I want the toe up toward the shin and I want the ankle braced at a 90-degree angle, a dorsiflex position. Then I look for a nice flat contact there and a rolling type of contact against the ground. In our coaching, we call it the rocking chair concept. And if you have a rocking chair at home, and you know what a rocking chair does against the floor, that's the concept that we want to use, so the entire surface of the foot is used to dissipate those forces there. Now, one last thing that I like to see at the end is I like to see what's called a foot bridge, meaning that I want the foot to flex at the forefoot, and I want to see that before the penultimate foot leaves the ground. And here's what I mean by that. This is about the easiest demonstration I have. So forgive the couthness, but I like to see the heel move down. I like to see a flat contact. And rather than the tibia shifting forward here, I want to see the ankle remaining at 90 degrees, and I want to see flexion here at the ball of the foot. There. And then the penultimate toes off this way. So we get a nice elastic effect there at the end of it. And that flexion of the ball of the foot is very important for several reasons. One is that it enables the ankle to maintain stability and stay at 90 degrees as the tibia moves forward. And the other reason is that it's a landmark for me as far as penultimate displacement. And I'll share a little bit more about that in just a second. Okay. So that's what I kind of look for as penultimate is concerned. Now, as far as the actual lowering of the body's center of mass, everybody always asks me how much. Well, a lot of it depends on ability levels and so forth and strength levels. So, sometimes people lower too much, sometimes they don't lower enough, in my opinion. But the thing that is important to me is where the lowering takes place with respect to where the penultimate foot is. And I look for my jumpers to lower in support versus in flight, meaning that I like to see my jumpers get the penultimate foot down and then lower in a down and forward direction in front of the penultimate step. Does it make sense to you? So what I'm saying is that I like to see them get on the penultimate. Let's say I'm a right-footed jumper, right-footed penultimate person, left foot takeoff. Get on the penultimate and then lower down and forward in this direction. So the actual lowering itself is occurring on the front side of where my foot is on the ground. A lot of times you'll see jumpers who do the majority of the lowering or do a lot of lowering in the flight phase prior to that, meaning that the actual lower during flight and then the penultimate step lands in front. That's consistent with stopping. So I'm coaching my athletes to lower in support versus lowering in flight. I want them to catch the penultimate, ground the penultimate in a fairly high position as far as the height of the hips and the height of the center of mass, and then lower down and forward onto the board. And when they hit the penultimate, this is what I like to see as far as a path of the center of mass. So this is typically the position that you'll see, and it's a little exaggerated as far as front side, but at penultimate grounding, this is the position that I kind of like to see. Something like this. And the cues that I'm giving the athlete here is that the path of the center of mass is here, and then leveling off as it moves into the board. And that's what we're trying to coach there. And that's very important. One of the biggest mistakes that we see in jumpers a lot is, and it's associated often with stopping on the penultimate, is jumpers who lower, and then you'll see a bit of a rise here. As they leave the penultimate, you actually see a little bit of an upward trajectory. And when that happens, you just completely ruin any impulse, vertical impulse you were able to develop on the board. So that's what I teach them. So again, and one of the things that I talk to them about a lot is you don't lower on your penultimate, you lower in front of your penultimate. And have you ever been on a roller coaster? Yeah, you've been on that big thing that comes down and hits the bottom and goes up, right? Well, keep in mind, that's what you're doing with your long jumpers. You're putting them on a roller coaster in those final couple of steps. And where the low point of the roller coaster is important. You see, so what I'm doing is conceptually, I'm trying to put the low point not where they are on the penultimate step. I'm trying to put the low point on the board. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So conceptually, that's what my jumpers are doing. They're hitting the penultimate and they're trying to lower onto the board. So that's the actual low point. In actuality, it's more like this. You get an initial lowering in front of the penultimate and then a leveling off, so to speak. But that's what we're trying to do conceptually. Questions? Yeah.
How do you avoid going into the penultimate? How do you avoid slapping instead?
Slapping the penultimate? I talk a lot about the run to penultimate chain. And when I see penultimates that slap, first of all, anytime you hear loud noises or like excessive front side, it's always associated with stopping. But when I see penultimates that are continuously in front, almost always that jumper has failed to continue to push through the hip on the step prior to the penultimate on that side. So for example, when I see jumpers who always have the penultimate too far in front, I go back to the fourth to last step and look at it real hard. Does that make sense to you? Remember, if I'm a left-footed takeoff, my penultimate's going to be my right. So I'll go back to the right step before the penultimate. And very often, rather than seeing a complete push-off, I see a softened contact there, where they're not pushing through the hip completely. And then next thing you know, the next step is a little further in front, and that's where that comes from. Okay, so that's what I go back to. And it's very similar, and we'll talk about takeoff step here in just a minute, and it's the same kind of idea on the takeoff step. When I see athletes who are posturally pretty good on the board, but the takeoff foot is always reaching or always stuck out in front, I go back to the third to last step. And almost always you'll see softening, and they're not really sprinting and pushing off and extending the hip completely on that step. So if you don't push off and create backside on the step before, then the next step tends to be more in front. And that's the whole essence of understanding the run-to-jump connection and why sprint mechanics affect the way you actually take off. Does that make sense to you? You see, when I teach the penultimate or the takeoff, either, this is not what happens on video, don't get me wrong, but this is what my athletes are trying to do conceptually. They're trying to push off completely, feel a little bit of backside, and then let the foot just fall underneath them. Now, there's some front side when you look at it on video, but again, conceptually, that's what they're trying to do. And that's what I do to minimize that front side distance. You wasn't expecting all that, were you? Okay, questions? Now the final thing about the penultimate that I feel strongly about and I look at real hard is displacement, meaning that I want them to move forward off of the penultimate significantly. So I'm constantly talking to athletes about leaving the foot behind them. If you're a left-footed takeoff and a right penultimate person, constantly cueing right foot behind you, feel the right behind you, feel the right behind you, because your penultimate leg becomes your swing leg or your drive knee, whichever term you prefer to use. I prefer the term swing. But if you leave the penultimate back and it stays back there a little while, then it creates a bigger arc through which to swing. So for example, it's a very simple demonstration. If I put my penultimate down, if I leave it back significantly, then I get a big, powerful swinging arc. And I get a nice strong swing leg at takeoff. On the other hand, if I put it down and I don't move very far, then I have a very short constricted arc. So I don't get nearly the quality of the swinging movement at takeoff, and we all know how important that is to takeoff. I mean, that's the first thing we start teaching in long jump is, a powerful drive leg or swing leg. But that's all dependent upon how well you displace off of the penultimate. And how do I know if an athlete is displaced off the penultimate enough? If I see bridging on the foot, then I know that they've traveled far enough at that particular point. So you see, I coach a penultimate step that stays behind for a while. And I also coach a strong drive leg at takeoff, but I want the drive leg to occur forcefully, but not early. I want it to occur late. Questions? All right, let's talk about takeoff here. Excuse me. As far as takeoff, we've already discussed posture and so forth, and we all know that we want, no forward lean, no backward lean, and all those kind of things as we put our foot on the board. But as far as the actual placement of the takeoff foot is concerned, one thing that I look for is pre-recruitment in the quad, meaning that I want the quad muscle to be stiffened up a bit in order to accept the impact on the board. Now, if the quad is stiffened, that means that something's got to change prior to that point, and that change is the recovery height. So I look for a low recovery of the foot as we move on to the board. A normal sprint stride, the heel comes off the butt. This is an exception. Here's where we want the foot to come through low. The quadricep, when it turns on, straightens the knee. So it's impossible to have a quadricep that's pretense and well prepared and at the same time have excessive knee flexion. Those two things don't happen. So I look for a low contact there. Now, as far as the actual contact on the board and the location, I'm constantly talking to athletes about keeping the takeoff foot underneath them. In actuality, in real life, on the video, you're looking at maybe this much front side distance is what you'll see. Okay. Maybe 6 inches or so. So the position I look for in the board, ideally, is something like this. So something like this, and I'm exaggerating just a bit for the sake of a clearer diagram, but something like that. Here, here, and there, and there. And of course, there's our board. And that's kind of what I'm looking for. Hips, shoulders on top of the hips, head in alignment, and just a little bit of front side on the foot. But again, I'm constantly talking to them about minimizing that front side. Okay. Questions? Now, what happens here? You have choices. You have options. And this is, to me, the essence of really coaching long jump well, is understanding what those options are and coaching the path of the center of mass from this point on. See, there are several things that you can do here. I can do this, or I can do this, or I can do this. And I would argue that this person lands here, and this person lands here, and this person lands here. So who wins? You see, so it's very important once the foot gets on the... Does it make sense to you? So it's very important once you get on the board to understand that horizontal forces and horizontal things need to continue at that point. So the time you get your foot on the board is not the time to go up. That's the time where we continue to move forward. We should continue to slide forward, and so that we actually get the hips over the foot and then push off of the board. I spend lots of time with my jumpers talking to them about not pulling on the board, meaning that trying to pull this way and go up early, but actually shifting the weight forward and actually pushing off of the board. And that gets back to the same pushing that we saw on the runway. And we talked about, if we see good pushing in the approach run, then you have a good chance to push off the board correctly. When you see athletes who run with their feet in front of them with grabbing types of steps, those are typically grabbers on the board. So for example, if I'm looking at a long jumper, and we just got on the board in this position here, I'm looking for these horizontal forces to continue. You see, it's important not just for velocity maintenance reasons, but it's also important because that's when you actually load the muscles. That's where you get the elastic benefit from takeoff. So what I look for here is when this foot hits, I look to see the tibia shift forward this way. So if you'll notice here, notice that this picture, very little has changed. The only thing that's actually occurred is that the tibia here has rotated forward. You notice that the position of the femur is basically the same. Everything's not changed very much. You see, so what we're actually doing is just sliding forward here to a position where the hips are on top of the foot. And then from this point on is where we actually try to develop our rise. So to break it down into a simpler terms that you can use with your athletes, I constantly tell them the rise, the lift that you feel at takeoff should always be occurring in front of the board. So you always feel the lifting occurring out in front. Get your height not over the runway, get your height over the sand. You're always trying to push out the peak of flight, so to speak. Okay? Does that make sense to you? And a good hallmark position, a good place to stop the video is the instant at which they leave the ground. So let's say that this is the toe-off position here. Something like that, yeah. And again, this might be a little exaggerated for demonstration purposes. But at the instant at which they leave the board, here, I look to make sure that the hips are significantly out in front of the foot. Because that's all free distance. That's all distance you get without having to cover anything. So typically, if those horizontal forces are continued, that's what we see. And in all of our film study sessions, that's what we look at. We always freeze it when you touch the board and evaluate there, and then when we leave the board to evaluate this whole displacement idea. Okay. Now, as far as the swing leg is concerned, we've already discussed it. There's nothing new there. But as far as the swing leg is concerned, the swing leg, if you understand this, it starts to make sense that it should not be a purely angular movement. Meaning that if you're a left-footed takeoff and you're driving the knee up, we don't want to see just the knee drive up. We want to see advancement of the axis of that swing. So I'm not just driving my knee up there, I'm actually driving the knee up, and the actual axis, the hip itself, is continuing to move forward at the same time. So it's kind of a moving axis as far as your swing leg is concerned with that point.
Are you concerned with keeping the heel away from the platform because takeoff, like sometimes athletes seem to just bring that heel up to the platform?
At takeoff?
Yeah.
I don't really concern myself with it too much because to me, recovery mechanics are always symptomatic of the way forces have been applied to the ground. And I don't coach it, but it does give some good clues as to what's going on. When I see the heel come up to the butt at that instant, normally that's indicative to me of pretty good velocity conservation. And when I see lower recoveries there, that indicates stopping and slowing to me. So I don't coach them to do that per se, but I do look for it and hope that it does exist.
So swinging your foot out is less effective.
I don't talk to them about swinging the foot. I talk to them about bringing the thigh forward a lot.
But if your leg would just swing, like if you were to say lead with your foot.
This way?
Yeah.
That means you've stopped.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've stopped. The body's going to seek symmetry. The body seeks symmetry. That's its natural state and so forth. So when you have jumpers who tend to stick out their foot this way on the board, they tend to swing the next step the same way. Did I answer your question? Now, artificially contrived high recoveries at takeoff, not a good idea. Keep in mind the body has a flexion reflex. When one joint flexes abruptly and quickly and early, then other joints tend to flex. And I've seen lots of jumpers, and we'll talk about this to a greater degree in triple jump. I've seen lots of jumpers who are so hung up on getting the knee up strong and early that they actually flex the hip and actually stick the butt out in that particular instance. And if that's what you're asking about, well, no, that's definitely a problem. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Yeah. So the free leg I'm always coaching is powerful and late and occurring out in front of the board. And getting back to our roller coaster example, that we start from a high position with good running mechanics, we lower onto the board with good penultimate mechanics, and the lift occurs on the front side. So if we were looking at our roller coaster, the low point is on the board conceptually. It may or may not be there in actuality, but that's what we're working for. Yes?
Were you hesitating on the board till
You're not hesitating. It's not a deceleration, but there is a fraction of a second of waiting, so to speak.
don't want to push off as fast?
No, when you get your foot on the board, it's not time to go up immediately. All right, you want to slide forward just a little bit. And the cues that I use with my jumpers there are, again, feel push rather than pull. because if you go too early, it'll feel like a pull. The other thing is that when you hit good jumps, you feel it more in your quad than in your hamstring. And I think that probably makes sense, because when you slide forward, that translation period that you see there, these two frames from here to here on the left, this is a loading phase for the quadricep muscle. I have good jumpers tell me that all the time. When they feel good, better jumps, they feel it more in their quad than they felt in their hamstring, and that makes sense to me. Makes good sense to me. So conceptually, what I teach them to do as far as planting the foot on the board is, let's say that I'm a left-footed takeoff person. On the third to last step, I have them push off nice and strong from that step, sprinting onto the takeoff, and then they're just allowing the foot to fall onto the board, and then they push. And that little bit of front side that you see on the video, that's part of a continuation of natural, of angular momentum. It's a continuation of elastic processes and so forth. That's what it feels like to them. I've had jumpers that literally I make them walk through this stuff, where they'll actually, and this is what they do in their rooms at night. To try to prevent these reaching out and grabbing kind of habits, is for left-footed takeoff people to get on the penultimate, get here, and then just stick. And that's what long jump feels like to them. Again, it doesn't look like that on video, but that's conceptually what they're feeling at really high speeds. Okay. And talking to them about leaving the takeoff foot behind is not a bad idea either. Now, as you take off from the board, not only we have the drag leg, but also the arms. You want continued big amplitudes of movement. Everything's just got to stay big and open, and as we move through flight. Any questions there? Okay, we're off the ground. Now, as far as flight's concerned, I'm not a big flight kind of guy. Physics tell us that parabolic paths are dictated prior to takeoff and so forth. So I don't spend a ton of time with flight. I know there's the old hitch kick versus hang argument, and which is better. And I tend to just kind of find a person's natural style and perfect it and work with them and so forth. There is one thing though that I think is very important, and that's what the free leg does after you leave the ground. I think the free leg has to extend and fall, because that's probably 90% of your rotation control, meaning that once you get it up at takeoff, you have to extend it, and it's got to be a little bit in front of you for a little while. Newton's laws, you have a clockwise action there, which produces a counterclockwise reaction, and that's probably 90% of your rotation fighting right there. So I do insist that they extend the free leg in flight. It's a very common mistake with certain jumpers who drive it up and then they'll bring it back bent to create the real big stretch and get into landing positions prematurely. But I don't allow them to do that. They have to extend the free leg, because that's how you control rotation. Now, once they take this leg and they extend it, if they want to do it again in hitch kick, fine, I'll teach you to do that. If they want to go into a hang from that position, well, that's fine too. But that's something that I'm adamant about in flight, and it's the only part of flight mechanics that I just feel is technique versus style. That is something that you just have to accomplish in order to succeed well. Questions? Y'all interested in landing ideas and so forth? Let's talk about those a little bit. As far as landing is concerned, when I teach landing, I kind of break it up in my mind into two categories of movements: the things that happen before you hit, and the things that happen after you hit, prior to impact and post-impact type of movements. So I teach landings to begin early. I want to see athletes who get ready to land near the peak of their flight. You spend the first part of your flight controlling rotation, and you get ready to land when you're really high in the air. I think that a lot of jumpers wait until they're on descent to get ready to land, and they get sloppy marks and have trouble, as a result. And if you have jumpers who scrape the sand a lot, yeah, those are people who are notorious for landing late. Sometimes in our practices, I'm not much of a gimmick kind of person, but when I have people who do that and habitually land late, I'll just put a little rubber band about 6 inches over the sand, right behind where their feet land, to make them have to move everything earlier and get into positions earlier and so forth. Now, as far as landing is concerned, at the peak of flight, we extend the legs, obviously. And what I look for is stretch reflexes there, because those help you to extend and put the legs out in front of you. So what I look for here is, once you drive this knee up, I look for it to extend, and it basically becomes like a hurdle tray leg movement back to extend. And the other leg follows, and goes out in front. I look for a torso to stay up. That's a little bit controversial to some people, but I teach the torso to remain up in flight, even at impact. I think the torso has a lot of mass. And when you bring the torso forward and reach for the toes, so to speak, putting the chest on the thighs, when you bring the torso down, there is a little bit of an upward reaction of the feet, but there's so much mass there that the whole relationship of the center of mass to where the feet are, you actually create a disadvantage. And you put the body into a ball and accelerate forward rotation. Just about every jumper I've ever seen who brings the chest down on the thighs at landing, as soon as the chest hits the thighs, you see the feet drop. And because there's no more rotation fighting capability at that point. So that's what I teach. I teach them to keep the torso up. Now, I teach arm sweep, meaning that you bring your arms down and forward, obviously. Downward reaction brings an upward reaction of the legs, but I don't teach them to bring their chest down. I want to see the chest up throughout the whole landing. Now, once they hit, the theme is absorb. So I teach flexion of the hips, flexion of the knees, and the whole idea here is to get your butt to fall in the hole where your feet were. That's what I try to do. So the whole idea of making your body into a spring or an accordion and absorbing those forces is important. I teach one of two maneuvers. When they hit, either I will teach them to turn to the side or to continue to travel forward square at that point. I personally like them turning to the side. With the elite jumpers, and the reason is, and maybe this is valuable, maybe it's not, but if you're going to have a 7, 8, 9, 10 year jumping career, and every time you land your knees get slammed, with excessive flexion time and time again, I really think that you turning to the side a little bit, especially when you can turn to the side, that alleviates some of the pressure on your takeoff leg. I think there's some value to it and saves some wear and tear on the body over time. If, on the other hand, the problem with that style is that a lot of athletes will anticipate prematurely, and you'll get staggered marks. Anytime, Newton's law is action and reaction. When you turn the shoulders, your feet tend to rotate in the opposite way. So anytime you have athletes who land one foot in front of the other, it's almost always because they've turned their shoulders prematurely. So you have to be really disciplined if you're going to use a turnout type of landing style. You have to make sure that your feet are in the sand before you begin to initiate the turning. If I have athletes...
What about the stress on the leg that obviously you're rotating towards?
Well, I don't think it hits that much stress, because the center of mass kind of rides up and over, so to speak. Now, when I have kids that land square and they stay square, I teach those kids a kick out type of technique, meaning that right about the time the butt is ready to drop into the hole where your feet are, you kick your feet up into the air. You see a lot of Europeans that land that way. But one thing about landing is that the perfect landing only occurs on the perfect jump. So my whole philosophy of teaching, sometimes you just, survival, and we spend a lot of time talking about what happens in perfect situations and so forth, but, it doesn't always happen that way. So what I do is, my philosophy of teaching landing is that I work on it. I'll typically do some exercises that help them understand how it's supposed to feel and so forth, but it's kind of up to them to connect the dots. For example, if I have a jumper who continuously experiences a little too much forward rotation because of some particular problem, well, they never have to kick the feet out or even worry about turning, because they always get rotated over their feet when they land, So again, like the perfect landing is for the perfect jump. And you need to, teach basic movement patterns about it, and I'll share some of those with you. How many of you are working with some young ones as well as older ones? Good. Well, good, because when we get to the practical session tonight, I'll teach you some progressions that are really good to teach kids landings and show them how it's supposed to feel and so forth. But again, like I said, it's about teaching them how it's supposed to feel, and then getting into positions where they can execute what they inherently feel like they should. Put them into positions where they can connect the dots themselves, so to speak. Questions? Okay. Let's look at some video. Okay, I think that I can reinforce a lot of this with a video. I have some old video. And the reason I use this old video is because, well, two reasons. Number one, long jump hasn't changed. You know. And the other thing is that, contrary to popular belief, and the other thing is that I feel pretty strongly about that. But this video is in slow motion, so it's very convenient to work with. So, plus I think these people are really good models, and I think this is also a place, also a video where there are some bad things to show you as well. Okay, so this control wasn't working quite so well earlier, so I was having to work it manually. So I'll be hiding behind this cabinet while you watch. Okay. And what I'll do is I'll try to guide you through the process here. Okay, I think this lady is a pretty good model. Is it clear enough for all of you to see and everything? Okay, I'm going to let it play one time, and where you can just get a sense of the jump, and then I'll back it up and I'll tell you where I'd like you looking. Okay, I'm going to let it play now, and what I would like you to do is I want you to get a sense of lowering and tell me what's happening. Is there lowering going on, and is it happening in support or flight or both? Ready? Watch here. What do you say? I think both. I see some lowering in the flight phase prior to the penultimate grounding, and I see a little bit more lowering once the penultimate actually grounds. And again, like I said, we're trying to keep as much of that lowering as possible in support. So watch here, there's a little bit of a fall, and then you see continued level path onto the bore. So that's not bad. There's some lowering going on there. That's a pretty good grade. Again, we're trying to keep as much of it as possible in support though. Now, as far as the actual penultimate mechanics are concerned, I want you to watch this. Okay, there's the left foot. Watch the left foot, ball of the foot. There you see ball of the foot. Here again you see contact on the ball of the foot. And here, that's not the ball of the foot, huh? It's a significantly different foot contact. And I'll go ahead and I'll stop it for you. Sorry, I'm a little late. Let me try that one more time. Okay. Now this is an important position, right prior to impact. First of all, what about the ankle preparation? Is it 90? Yeah, it is. Yeah. Film might be a little fuzzy, but it's really good, and there's something behind that's kind of obstructing, but it looks like she's going to contact on the heel, and that's what I mean when I say leading with the heel down to ground. I'm going to try to bump it forward a few frames. Now you can get a little better picture of the ankle too. See this nice and square, and now she is down. Okay, and there's our stick figure. So is the penultimate underneath us? Just a little bit in front, and this is a good position that I like to evaluate film. You know, at this position, you know, pretty good torso, vertical shin at touchdown, and if you'll notice, this foot is actually below the knee, which means that the other leg is coming through in a lower position. Now watch what happens as she moves off of this penultimate. We said the thing that we don't want to do is get off of it quick. What we'd like to do is continue to move forward and bridge. So here we're moving forward, and they see the hips are traveling basically level. You can judge by the curve of the track in the background. There's no rise here. But there's the foot, and there's toe off. So you see it's back, and it's still back, and it's still back, and it's only now that you start to see it move forward and accelerate greatly. So I'm going to let you play through that one more time. Now, as we move on to the board here, can you see the ankle preparation? Excellent, isn't it? Okay, so it's dorsiflex, and I'm going to stop it right when she gets on the board, and there we go. Okay, how do you evaluate this position? Posture? I think the shoulders are back a little too much, don't you? And just a touch. All right, it's not bad. I mean, the people that we're coaching are making mistakes that are much more gross than this. But generally speaking, you know, this is like a A- kind of position. And you can see that the foot is just a little in front of the hips, even though she thinks it's underneath her. Okay, and what we're going to do now is I'd like you to look, and I want you to tell me at what point we start to see the lift. You see here we see level travel, level, level, still level, still level, still level, and it's only right here that I start to see a little bit of rise. So she slides forward, and now we start to see the upward lift. Hips in front of the foot? Yeah, pretty good. Pretty good. Nice split and everything, so forth. So let me let that play so you can get a feel for it. And again, what I'd like you to feel here through this video is the continued horizontal movement through the board.
When she brings her drive leg through and her heels right up underneath her butt, does that go against what you were saying earlier with keeping it a little bit low?
No, here's where I want it low. Look at the position of the right foot as it goes onto the board. Okay, that's where I want a low heel recovery. So let me back this up and I'll clarify that. Let me back her all the way up over here. Okay, so right here, watch the right foot. There you see heel on the butt. Heel on the butt. And not a heel on the butt. You see what I'm getting at there? So there was definitely a decrease in recovery height. Now the free leg on the other side, yeah, there's a high recovery and there should be. Okay. So we all right with that? Okay, now we're off the board. And if Coach Boo's your coach, he's going to tell you to take this left leg now and extend it and move it out in front of you just a little bit. Let's see if she does that. Yep. And there you see it. Okay, now here she is. Is she getting ready to land? Yeah, I see some, kind of looks like she's getting ready already, and you see how high in the air she is? So, nice early preparation for landing. Okay, and there we see the right leg shooting forward, and there you see the left leg coming through like a hurdle trail leg, so the legs are extending. Okay, anybody see a problem here? Torso, yeah. I don't particularly care for the low torso here, the reach for the toes thing, because if you'll notice, here she goes, she reaches for the toes, now the chest is on the thighs, and watch the feet. See the feet start to drop away? Yeah. So let's allow that to play full speed. So free leg extends, get ready to land. Okay, everything looks good except the chest is low, and watch the feet drop. You see? So typically when you drop the chest like that, the feet tend to fall. All right, let's go ahead and pick somebody else out. Bear with me, it'll take about, we'll be where I want to be in about 5 more jumps.
What's the correction for that? Is the midsection to be that much stronger to keep the legs up, or is there a postural correction in the air?
No, just to them more. No, it's just it's habit. It has nothing to do with strength or anything like that. Okay, let's watch this one. I like this one. Okay, Now again, a right-footed takeoff. So what I'm going to get you to do is I want you to watch the left foot. Okay, so ball of the foot contact there. Ball of the foot. And then a full-footed contact. So noticeably different contact on the penultimate stride. Okay. All right, now let's go back and look at it and see how it contacts. Okay, penultimate's about to hit. What about the position of the ankle? 90 degrees, huh? Really good. Okay, and again, it looks like we're going to hit on the heel. We get that heel lead type of concept there. Right now, I'll bump it forward a few frames. All right, and now we're flat. And there you see the same position that we saw earlier. If you notice, we got shoulders on top of hips pretty good, and we got a vertical tibia, the knees together, and this foot, again, it's not quite as low as it was, so this recovery onto the board is going to be a little higher, but this is still acceptable. You know, to me, a parallel to the ground shin at that point is about what that'd be like your minimum. Okay, now let's see as he moves forward from the penultimate. Okay. Lowering's basically done. Notice he's traveling level, not up. And you can see the foot here bridging. All right. So the ankle's solid up on the ball of the foot. And notice the foot hanging back, hanging back, hanging back, still hanging back, still hanging back. And it's only now that you start to see it move forward just a little bit. So what we're trying to do here on that left side is create stretch reflex in the hip flexor group. So leaving the foot back like that increases that. And that's what I'm going to let you watch here at full speed. So here comes the penultimate. Grounds, hangs back a little while, and then comes forward. Okay, now let's look at the takeoff foot and see what's going on. Okay, we're right-footed takeoff here, so let's track the right foot. And there you see right foot on the heel, a heel on the butt. Then you see the right foot on the butt again. And here you see the right foot not near the butt. You see the low recovery there. And here he's about to hit the board. I'll let that play one more time. Okay. And here he is about to put the foot on the board. Can't really see the ankle preparation because of the camera stands and everything, but it's not quite as dorsiflex as it was before. But, you know, you definitely don't want to be toeing the board there. Flat is your minimum standard, minimum acceptable standard there. But let's get it down. And, okay, there we are. It looks like we're down here. Okay, how's that position? Shoulders look good, huh? Shoulders right on top of the hips. A little bit of front side with the foot. And again, we're trying to keep it under us, but there's a little bit of front side there. And if you'll notice forward movement, notice we're going to slide forward, 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 still moving forward, still moving forward, still moving forward. And it's only right now that I start to see some rise. Okay, so that continued horizontal movement after impact, that phase is important again. That's where we get in the load and you see the tibia rotate forward. And I go ahead and I'll bump it forward until he's off. So now you can see a nice vigorous push up and then he's off. Okay, and right now, are the hips out in front of the foot? Yeah. Okay, so we got nice displacement here. The hips are significantly past the foot. We got a nice split in the legs. Everything's looking pretty good. Let me let you look at it at full speed. Okay, let's evaluate his flight mechanics here. Okay, the free leg ought to extend and fall, right? So here's your left leg extending. It's out in front. It hitch kicks, and we're fine. Okay, that's pretty, isn't it? So now he does things a little different. Instead of going into a hang here, he goes into another hitch kick maneuver. And now he's getting ready to land early, real high in the air when he begins his landing. You can see the legs starting to extend forward. The hands are in position to sweep. A little different position here. The chest stays up and he reaches with the arms. So the chest position's good. And at impact, the heels hit and the butt moves toward the heels. And he tries to drop them in the same hole. Not bad, eh? Now how about we look at some things that maybe are a little different, maybe aren't so pretty, in the few minutes we have left. These are two very good models that I showed you. Now let's look at some things that are a little more radical. This is interesting. Okay, we talked about penultimate displacement. Now watch this jump, because it's interesting. There's your penultimate. Okay, you see how the takeoff foot is already out in front? Okay, so here you'll notice that she's off the penultimate very quick, and the foot doesn't stay back nearly as long. And if you'll notice now, as a result, we get a much shorter constricted drive leg. See how it isn't just quite as open as the one before? Let me let you look at that. And as a result, the foot falls back early, and we don't get quite the forward rotation control, and we end up with an arch back in flight. See, the foot doesn't get out in front. Let's see. Maybe one more. Yeah, I think this jump is real interesting. Okay, not this one, but this one coming. Okay, just watch the penultimate here. Okay, what do you think of the penultimate step? Pretty good, huh? But things change after that. Bear with me one second. Okay. All right, here she is on the board. Now watch how much earlier she goes up here. I've been preaching continued horizontal movement. You see how she's popping up already? And you see now she's toeing off the board, or the hips in front of the foot. Not nearly as much as the previous people we saw. Let me let you back that up and look at it. Yeah. But this is an example of what we call early jumping or premature jumping. And you were asking the question, that's one of the reasons why I pulled this one out. When you get your foot on the board, it's not the time to go up. And here you can see, boop. And so instead of the horizontal forces continuing, you see a noticeable vertical deviation right there at that point. Yeah. I think my time's up, guys. So, anyway, any questions to wrap things up? And hopefully I was able to reinforce some of that stuff with the video. Yeah.
It seems like with that penultimate, less about dropping of the hips.
Less?
More about getting into the proper position.
I don't know if that's true. But keep in mind, I don't coach a hip drop at all. I coach a hip down and forward. So if that's consistent with what you're asking me, did I answer your question?
Well, the importance of being in the proper position, I guess they come hand in hand. But what would be more important, putting yourself in the proper position or lowering yourself to the proper depth?
Why can't we do both? But I teach proper positioning more so than lowering. Lowering is an interesting thing because it's always subjective as to how much you should lower. You know, with those of you who are dealing with real young kids, simply flattening out the foot on the penultimate step provides enough lowering. Whereas if you're dealing with people who are older and more, stronger and better athletes and so forth, lowering a few centimeters may be valuable. But I'm constantly coaching positions. Still not sure I understand your question 100%, but I always evaluate positions, I guess you'd say. But I don't know why you can't do both. Any other questions? All right, let's break it off and then we'll take our quick break and then we'll come back and do a triple jump.